The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor as Cordelia Ashwick fled from her fifth suitor this month, her silk skirts rustling with each desperate step toward the mansion's grand staircase. Behind her, the portly banker's son called out pathetic promises of wealth and comfort. But she'd rather die an old maid than marry another spineless fortune hunter who saw only her father's railroad money. She burst through the French doors onto the moonlit terrace, gasping for breath, only to freeze at the sight of a figure standing in the shadows of the garden. Even in the darkness, she could make out his imposing silhouette, broad shoulders beneath a perfectly tailored black coat, tall frame that spoke of power and danger. But it was what she couldn't see clearly that made her heart race, the scarred half of his face that he kept turned away from the light. Miss Ashwick. His voice was like aged whiskey, rough and intoxicating. Running from another suitor? Kestrel. Ravencrest, the richest rancher in 3 counties and the most eligible bachelor. No woman would touch. She'd heard the whispers about him, seen how even the boldest socialites shuddered when he entered a room. Half his face had been destroyed in a cattle stampede 5 years ago, leaving him hideously scarred and utterly alone despite his vast fortune. Mr. Ravencrest, she breathed, moving closer instead of backing away like everyone else did. I didn't. No, you were attending tonight. He turned slightly, keeping his ruined profile in shadow. Make it a point to observe the marriage market from time to time. It's fascinating how desperation smells the same whether you're buying cattle or bidding. For a wife, his bitterness cut through the night air. And Cordelia felt something twist in her chest, not revulsion, but recognition. Here was another soul, trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Is that what you think this is? She asked, gesturing toward the glittering ballroom where her father was no doubt introducing her to yet another potential husband. A market, isn't it? Your father parades you before every eligible man west of the Mississippi, hoping someone will bite. Run from each one like your life depends on it. The accuracy of his observation stung because it was true. At 23, she was considered practically spinsterish by society's standards. But every man who courted her saw only dollar signs and breeding potential. And what about you, Mr. Ravencrest? Do you frequent these gatherings to find a wife? Who can stomach looking at your face? The words were out before she could stop them, harsh and cruel in a way that made her immediately regret them. But instead of anger, she heard something unexpected: laughter. Dark, bitter laughter that held no mirth. Direct. I appreciate that. He stepped into a shaft of moonlight, and Cordelia got her first clear look at the damage. The entire right side of his face was a tapestry of scar tissue, his eye milky white and unseeing, his mouth pulled into a permanent grimace by damaged muscles. She should have gasped, should have turned away like every other woman who'd ever seen him clearly. Instead, she found herself studying the unmarked left side of his face, the sharp cheekbone, the strong jaw, the steel-gray eye that watched her with wounded intensity. No, she said quietly. No woman has ever agreed to marry you, would you? The question came out like a gunshot, surprising them both. If I asked right now, would you marry a monster for his money? Cordelia stepped closer, close enough to see the pain hidden behind his cynical mask. That depends. Are you asking me to marry your scars, or are you asking me to marry you? The question hung between them like a challenge, and for the first time in 5 years, Kestrel Ravencrest found himself looking into eyes that held curiosity instead of horror. What's the difference? Kestrel asked, but his voice had lost its sharp edge, replaced by something vulnerable and uncertain. Cordelia circled him slowly. She might examine a piece of art in her father's collection, and he forced himself to remain still, despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. No one had looked at him this long since the accident truly looked not just stolen, horrified glances. Your scars are what happened to you, she said thoughtfully, coming to stand directly in front of him. But they're not who you are. Though, I suspect you've forgotten the difference. Have I? His laugh was hollow. I can't remember the last time someone saw anything else when they looked at me. Then they weren't looking hard enough. Cordelia reached up, and Kestrel jerked backward. Instinctively, she paused, her hands suspended in the air between them. May I?" The simple request for permission stunned him. When was the last time someone had asked instead of simply recoiling? His throat worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed. A nod, her fingertips touched the scarred side of his face with infinite gentleness, tracing the worst of the damage without flinching. Her touch was warm, curious rather than clinical, and Kestrel felt something long frozen begin to crack inside his chest. "What do you see?" he whispered, afraid of the answer but needing to know. "Pain," she said simply. "Years of it. But also strength, the kind that comes from surviving something that should have killed you. And loneliness so deep it's carved lines even the scars can't hide." Tears he hadn't shed since the night of the accident burned behind his eyes. "And that doesn't revolt you? Why would it? I look in the mirror every morning and see the same loneliness staring back at me. Different wounds, Mr. Ravencrest, but wounds all the same." Before he could respond, the terrace doors burst open and Malcolm Ashwick strode out, his face flushed with wine and anger. "Cordelia, what are you doing out here? Young Pemberton is waiting too." He stopped short when he saw Kestrel, his expression shifting from annoyance to calculation in an instant. "Mr. Ravencrest, I didn't realize you were interested in joining tonight's festivities." The dismissive tone made Cordelia's spine stiffen with protective fury. "Father, Mr. Ravencrest was keeping me company while I took some air." "How ... kind of him." Malcolm's eyes gleamed with sudden avarice. "You know, Ravencrest, we should talk. Business sometime soon. I have some railroad ventures that might interest a man of your ... resources." The crude pivot to money matters made Kestrel's jaw clench. But it was Cordelia's disgusted expression that surprised him most. She looked ready to physically strike her own father. "Perhaps another time," Kestrel said coolly. "I was just leaving." "Nonsense. The night is young, and Cordelia needs to meet more suitable father." Cordelia's voice cut through his bluster. "Like a blade? I believe I've met quite enough men tonight. In fact, I think I've met the most interesting one right here." The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Malcolm's face went purple, Kestrel went perfectly still, and Cordelia lifted her chin with regal defiance. "What exactly are you saying?" Malcolm sputtered. "I'm saying that if Mr. Ravencrest were to ask for my hand, I would be inclined to accept." The words hit Kestrel like a physical blow. She couldn't mean it, no, one would choose him willingly, scars and loneliness and all. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw not pity or calculation, but something far more dangerous. Genuine interest. "Cordelia," he said carefully, "you don't know what you're saying, don't I?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. "I know that in 5 minutes of conversation, you've shown me more honesty than a dozen other suitors managed in months. I know that your pain calls to something in me that I didn't even realize was there." "This is preposterous." Malcolm interrupted. "Cordelia, go inside this instant. We'll discuss this madness tomorrow." But Cordelia didn't move, her gaze locked with Kestrel's good eye. "What do you say, Mr. Ravencrest? Are you brave enough to find out what might grow between two wounded souls?" Kestrel stared at her for a long moment, seeing not just beauty but fierce intelligence and a strength that matched his own. For the first time in 5 years, he allowed himself to hope. "Miss Ashwick," he said formally, though his voice shook slightly, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Cordelia said without hesitation, her voice ringing clear across the terrace. "Yes, I will marry you." Malcolm Ashwick's face went from purple to white in the span of a heartbeat. "Have you lost your mind? Can't seriously mean to what, father? Marry the wealthiest rancher in the territory? Accept a proposal from a man who owns more land than some eastern states?" "Ah!" Cordelia's smile was sharp as a blade. "I thought you wanted me to make an advantageous marriage." Kestrel watched the interplay with fascination, seeing Cordelia's steel core emerge as she faced down her father's objections. This was no shrinking violet to be intimidated. This was a woman who could hold her own against anyone but his ... his face ... Malcolm stammered, gesturing helplessly. "Is the face of the man I'm going to marry," Cordelia finished coldly. "If you have a problem with my choice, father, perhaps you should examine your own priorities." The rebuke hit home, and Malcolm's expression shifted from outrage to calculation. Once again, Kestrel could practically see the wheels turning, scarred or not, The Ravencrest fortune was legendary, and this marriage would unite two of the most powerful families in the territory. Perhaps, 8. Perhaps we should discuss the particulars. Malcolm said slowly. The dowry arrangements, the wedding date, ... There won't be any dowry, Kestrel said firmly. I want nothing from you, Ashwick, except your daughter's hand freely given. Freely given and freely offered, Cordelia added, her fingers finding Kestrel's and intertwining with surprising boldness. The contact sent electricity shooting up his arm, and he had to fight not to stare at their joined hands. The wedding should be soon, Malcolm continued, his businessman's instincts overriding his initial shock. Quiet ceremony, given the ... circumstances? No. Cordelia's voice was absolute. If I'm marrying Kestrel Ravencrest, I want the entire territory to know it. I want a celebration that befits the joining of two great families. I want everyone who whispered about the scarred bachelor and the spinster heiress to see exactly how wrong they were. Kestrel stared at her in amazement. Not only was she willing to marry him, she wanted to make it a public declaration, to stand beside him proudly, before all the people who had shunned them both. Cordelia, he said softly, you don't understand what you're asking. The stares, the whispers, the cruel speculation. Let them stare, she replied fiercely. Let them whisper. They've been doing both for years anyway. At least now they'll have something interesting to talk about. A laugh escaped him, genuine and surprised. When was the last time someone had made him laugh without bitterness? You're extraordinary. No, I'm tired. Tired of being paraded around. Like a prize heifer. Tired of pretending to be interested in men who bore me senseless. Tired of living my life according to other people's expectations. She turned to face him fully, her green eyes blazing with determination. At you. Kestrel Ravencrest, you make me feel awake for the first time in years. The raw honesty in her voice stole his breath. He'd expected gratitude, perhaps, or even pity disguised as affection. He hadn't expected this fierce, genuine attraction that seemed to burn away everything except the essential truth of who they were beneath their wounds. 6 weeks, he said suddenly. Give me 6 weeks to court you properly, if you still want. This marriage after that after, you've seen what life with me would really be like, then we'll have the grandest wedding the territory has ever seen. And if I change my mind, she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew she wouldn't, then you'll have had the most interesting courtship of your life, and I'll have had 6 weeks of happiness to remember. Cordelia smiled, and it transformed. Her entire face from pretty to luminous. 6 weeks it is. Right. But Kestrel. Yes. You're going to have to try very hard to convince me to change my mind. From inside the ballroom, the sound of a waltz drifted through the night air. Without thinking, Kestrel extended his hand. Would you care to dance, Miss Ashwick? She took his hand without hesitation, stepping into his arms as naturally as breathing. They moved together on the moonlit terrace away from prying eyes and cruel whispers. Two wounded souls discovering they could still remember how to be whole. As they swayed to the distant music, Kestrel felt something he'd thought was lost forever. Hope. And in Cordelia's eyes, he saw not the reflection of his scars, but the possibility of a future he'd never dared to imagine. The next morning brought a storm of gossip that swept through Willowbrook like wildfire. By the time Cordelia descended for breakfast, 3 different neighbors had already called to express their concerns about her shocking engagement. And her father was deep in hushed conversation with his business partners about the financial implications. She ignored them all. Her mind focused on the letter that had arrived with the sunrise, an invitation from Kestrel to visit his ranch and see exactly what she'd be taking on as his wife. You can't seriously be considering actually going through with this madness, her Aunt Prudence declared, bursting into the dining room without ceremony. The man is practically a hermit. No one's seen him in polite society for years. Perhaps that says more about polite society than it does about him. Cordelia replied mildly, buttering her toast with deliberate calm. Don't be flippant. This affects more than just you, affects the entire family's reputation. What will people say when they hear Malcolm Ashwick's daughter married that ... that monster? The word hung in the air like poison, and Cordelia felt her temper flare. They'll say she was smart enough to recognize a good man when she met one. Good man, child? Have you seen his face? Yes, Aunt Prudence. I've seen his face. Oh, I've also seen his soul, which is more than I can say for most of the men who've courted me. 2 hours later, Cordelia sat in her finest riding habit as Kestrel's carriage wound through the gates of Ravencrest Ranch. The property stretched beyond the horizon, thousands of acres of rolling grassland dotted with cattle, framed by distant mountains that looked like purple jewels against the sky. It's magnificent, she breathed, and meant it. Kestrel, who'd been watching her reaction with obvious anxiety, allowed himself a small smile. Wait until you see the house. The mansion that rose before them was a testament to both wealth and taste. 3 stories of honey-colored stone with sweeping verandas and tall windows that caught the light like mirrors. It was grand without being ostentatious, powerful without being intimidating. You built this? She asked as he helped her from the carriage. Designed it anyway? I had plenty of time to think after. ... He gestured vaguely at his face. Solitude breeds creativity, apparently. As they walked toward the front entrance, Cordelia noticed something that made her heart ache. There were no mirrors visible anywhere. The windows were positioned to avoid reflections, the decorative elements carefully chosen to eliminate any surface that might show his scarred visage. Kestrel, she said gently, stopping him with a hand on his arm. When did you last look at yourself? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? I mean really looked. Not just glimpses while shaving or quick glances in shop windows. When did you last stand before a mirror and see yourself as you truly are? His jaw tightened. The night of the accident? I haven't. ... I can't. You can't heal from wounds you refuse to acknowledge, she said softly. And you can't build a marriage on hiding from reality. Before he could protest, she was leading him through the grand foyer toward the main staircase. Halfway up, she stopped before a large mirror that had been draped with black cloth. Cordelia, no, but she was already pulling the fabric away, revealing their reflection in the silvered glass. Kestrel flinched instinctively, tried to turn away, but she caught his face in her hands and held him steady. Look, she commanded gently. Really look. In the mirror, she saw what the rest of the world saw, a man destroyed and rebuilt, half his face a ruin of scarred tissue and damaged flesh. But she also saw what they missed: the strength in his unmarked jaw, the intelligence in his good eye. The way his damaged features spoke not of weakness, but of survival. What do you see? She asked, echoing his question from the night before. A monster, he whispered, his voice breaking. Look again. Look harder. This time, she moved to stand behind him in the reflection, her hands still framing his face, her own features a study in acceptance and growing love. I see a man who survived something that should have killed him, she said firmly. I see someone who built an empire from nothing, who created beauty even while believing himself destroyed. I see the man I'm going to marry, scars and all. Eyes met in the mirror, her green ones steady and sure, his gray one filled with wonder and dawning hope. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached up to cover her hands with his own. How? He asked. How can you see all that when I can't? Because love doesn't look at surfaces, she replied simply. It looks deeper. I see when I look deeper. Kestrel Ravencrest is a man worth loving. The word hung between them, love, spoken aloud for the first time, transforming everything. In the mirror's reflection, Cordelia saw the moment Kestrel truly began to believe he might be worthy of it, and in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she was already falling in love with the scarred, lonely, magnificent man who was brave enough to let her see past his wounds to his soul. 3 weeks into their courtship, Kestrel took Cordelia to the place where his accident had happened, a narrow canyon where flash floods had once trapped his cattle and nearly killed him. She'd asked to see it, needing to understand the source of his wounds. And he'd agreed, despite the cold fear that settled in his stomach at the thought of returning. They rode side by side through the autumn morning, their horses picking their way carefully down the rocky trail. Cordelia had proven to be an exceptional rider, fearless and graceful in the saddle. and watching her handle her spirited mare with easy confidence had only deepened his admiration. "There," he said, pointing to a section of the canyon where the walls narrowed dramatically. "That's where it happened." She studied the terrain with intelligent eyes, taking in the evidence of old flood damage and the treacherous footing that could turn deadly in seconds. "Tell me what happened." For a moment, he couldn't speak. The memories crashed over him like the floodwaters themselves, the terrified bellowing of trapped cattle, the roar of rushing water, the moment of agonizing choice between saving the animals and saving himself. "I tried to save them," he said finally, his voice hoarse. 200 head of prime cattle trapped in rising water. I could have gotten out, should have gotten out. But I kept thinking about the families who depended on this ranch, the men who worked for me. "So you stayed?" "I stayed. Got most of them to safety before the real flood hit. But I was too slow getting myself out. A wall of water caught me, slammed me against the rocks." His hand instinctively went to his scarred face. Woke up 3 days later looking like a monster. Cordelia dismounted and walked to the edge of the narrow passage, her fingers trailing over the smooth stones worn by countless floods. "How many cattle did you lose?" 12. Out of 200. "And how many people kept their livelihoods because of what you did?" He blinked, surprised by the question. "I 50 families, maybe more. But that doesn't what? Make you a hero?" She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with fierce pride. "Kestrel Ravencrest, you sacrificed your face to save the lives and livelihoods of everyone who depended on you. You looked at death and chose duty over self-preservation. How is that not the definition of heroic? Heroes don't end up as monsters. Heroes end up scarred." She interrupted, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "They end up marked by their sacrifices, changed by their choices. The only difference between heroes and cowards is that heroes carry their wounds with honor." She was magnificent in her anger, beautiful and terrible as a storm, and Kestrel felt something shift deep in his chest. For 5 years, he'd seen only the cost of his choice. She was showing him its value. "Is that how you see me?" he asked quietly. "As a hero? I see you as a man who chose to save others at great cost to himself. I see someone who spent 5 years in exile, not because the world rejected him, but because he rejected himself." She moved closer, her hand reaching up to trace the worst of his scars. "I see someone who needs to forgive himself for surviving." The words hit him like a physical blow, because they were true. He'd been carrying guilt not just about his appearance, but about living when those 12 cattle had died, about building a fortune on the foundation of that terrible night. "They were just animals," he said, "but there was no conviction in it. They were lives in your care. And you honored that responsibility even when it cost you everything." She stood on her toes and pressed her lips gently to his scarred cheek. "I've never been more proud to be engaged to anyone in my life." The simple kiss, placed on the part of him he hated most, broke something loose inside his chest. The tears he'd held back for 5 years finally fell. And Cordelia held him while he mourned, not just for his lost face, but for the years of self-hatred. The isolation, the belief that he was somehow less than human. "I love you," he said against her hair, the words torn from somewhere deep and honest. "God help me, Cordelia. I love you." "Good," she replied fiercely, her own tears mixing with his. "'Cause I love you too, you magnificent, stubborn, heroic fool." When they finally separated, Kestrel felt lighter than he had in years. The canyon walls no longer seemed to close in on him with memories of pain and failure. Instead, they stood as witnesses to the moment he'd truly become the man Cordelia saw when she looked at him. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "Let's go home. Want to start planning our wedding? And I have some very specific ideas about the decorations." As they rode out of the canyon together, Kestrel realized that for the first time since the accident, he was looking forward to the future instead of hiding from the past. The wedding day dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of Cordelia's childhood bedroom, as her maid helped her into the most beautiful dress she'd ever owned. Made of ivory silk with intricate beadwork that caught the light like captured stars. It had been designed to complement rather than compete with the groom's dramatic appearance. "Miss Cordelia," her maid Rosalie whispered, adjusting the cathedral-length veil. "You look like an angel." Through the window, Cordelia could see guests arriving at the church, more people than had attended any social event in Willowbrook's history. Word of the unusual match had spread across 3 territories, drawing curious spectators alongside friends and family. Some came to gawk, others to witness what they considered a beautiful act of charity. But Cordelia knew the truth. They were about to see a love story that would redefine their understanding of what marriage could be. "He's here," Rosalie announced, peering through the lace curtains. "Oh, my stars, Miss Cordelia." "He looks ... like what?" Cordelia asked, checking her appearance one final time in the mirror. "Like a prince. A dark, dangerous prince who's finally found his princess." Cordelia smiled, remembering the transformation she'd witnessed over the past 6 weeks. The bitter, isolated man she'd first met on her father's terrace had slowly emerged from his self-imposed exile. Growing more confident with each passing day, he'd started riding through town again, attending business meetings, even accepting social invitations, all because she'd shown him that his worth wasn't determined by his appearance at the church. Kestrel stood at the altar trying to control his nerves. He'd chosen to forego the traditional morning coat in favor of a perfectly tailored black suit that emphasized his imposing height and broad shoulders. More importantly, he'd made a decision that morning that had shocked his valet. He would not wear the partial mask he'd been crafting for the ceremony. If Cordelia wanted the world to see their love story, then he would give her honesty in its rawest form, the whispers that rose from the packed pews. When he turned to face the aisle without any attempt to hide his scars were audible even over the organ music. Kestrel kept his eyes fixed on the back of the church, waiting for the only opinion that mattered. When the doors opened and Cordelia appeared on her father's arm, the entire congregation fell silent. She was luminous in her wedding gown, but it was her expression that took Kestrel's breath away. Pure joy and love so radiant it seemed to light the entire church. Their eyes met across the length of the aisle, and in that moment, everyone else faded away. There was only Cordelia walking toward him with absolute confidence, her smile growing brighter with each step. When she reached the altar, she didn't hesitate or falter at the sight of his uncovered scars. She simply took his offered hand and squeezed it gently, telling him without words that she was exactly where she belonged. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but his words seemed to come from far away. Kestrel was lost in Cordelia's eyes, in the miracle of her presence beside him, in the impossible reality that this remarkable woman had chosen him. The vows they exchanged were traditional in words but revolutionary in meaning. When Cordelia promised to love him in sickness and in health, in beauty and in scars, her voice rang with such conviction that several women in the congregation began to weep. When Kestrel vowed to cherish and protect the woman who saw light, where others saw darkness, his voice broke with emotion but never wavered in certainty. "You may kiss the bride," the minister announced. And Kestrel hesitated for just a moment, not from doubt, but from wonder that this moment was actually happening. Cordelia solved his dilemma by rising on her toes and kissing him first. Her lips meeting his with perfect tenderness, while the congregation erupted in applause. When they separated, she whispered something only he could hear. "See? Nothing to be afraid of after all." The reception at Ravencrest Ranch was a celebration unlike anything the territory had ever seen. Cordelia had insisted on an outdoor ceremony under the stars, with hundreds of lanterns strung between the trees and tables laden with the finest food and wine money could buy. But the real magic wasn't in the decorations. It was in watching two people who had found perfect completeness in each other. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Kestrel marveled at how naturally Cordelia fit in his arms, how right it felt to hold her close while the rest of the world watched. The whispers had changed from speculation to admiration as the guests witnessed the genuine love between the scarred rancher and his radiant bride. "Happy?" Cordelia asked, looking up at him with eyes that held their entire future. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he replied, spinning her gently as the music swelled around them. 5 years later, Kestrel Ravencrest stood in the nursery of their home, holding their newborn daughter while their 3-year-old son tugged at his trouser. leg, demanding attention. The morning sun streamed through windows that were no longer positioned to avoid reflections. The house was filled with mirrors now, because Kestrel had learned to see himself through Cordelia's eyes. "Papa, tell the story," little Marcus demanded. His dark hair tousled from sleep, and his green eyes so like his mother's bright with excitement. "Which story?" Kestrel asked, though he already knew the answer. "About how you and Mama fell in love? About the scars and the soul?" Kestrel chuckled, settling into the rocking chair with baby Isabella in his arms, while Marcus climbed onto his lap with the fearless confidence of a child who had never known anything but unconditional love. Well, he began, his voice taking on the storytelling cadence that had become a bedtime tradition. "Once upon a time, there was a cowboy who thought he was too broken to be loved. ... From the doorway, Cordelia watched her husband tell their children the fairy tale version of their courtship, the one where the scarred prince learned that true love sees not with eyes but with the heart. She'd heard the story dozens of times, but it never failed to move her because she remembered how it had really happened, how much courage it had taken for both of them to look past surfaces to souls. Their marriage had become legendary throughout the territory, not just because of the dramatic circumstances of their courtship, but because of what they'd built together. Kestrel had emerged from his isolation to become one of the most respected leaders in the region, while Cordelia had channeled her fierce intelligence into charitable work that had transformed dozens of communities. But their greatest achievement, WASNT Publicate, was private. It was the way Kestrel had learned to wear his scars as badges of honor instead of shame. It was the way Cordelia had discovered that true partnership meant finding someone whose strengths complemented your own. It was the way they'd created a love story that inspired others to look deeper, love bolder, and believe that healing was always possible. And they lived happily ever after. Marcus recited along with his father, already knowing the ending by heart. "The happiest," Kestrel confirmed, looking up to meet Cordelia's eyes across the room. In them, he still saw the woman who had danced with him on a moonlit terrace and chosen to marry not his wounds, but his soul. Though Cordelia added, entering the nursery with a smile that still took his breath away after 5 years of marriage, "The best part of their story is that it's still being written." That afternoon, as they walked through the town of Willowbrook with their children, Kestrel noticed something that never failed to amaze him. People no longer stared at his scars. Newcomers might glance curiously at first, but the locals saw only the man who had donated money to build their school, who employed half the county, who loved his wife and children with a devotion that had become the standard by which other marriages were measured. "Any regrets?" Cordelia asked, slipping her hand into his as they watched Marcus chase butterflies in the town square, while baby Isabella gurgled contentedly in her prom. "Only one," Kestrel replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me so long to realize that the right person doesn't see your scars as flaws to overlook. They see them as proof of your strength to survive." Cordelia stopped walking and turned to face him fully, her hands framing his face just as she had that first night on the terrace. "And what do you see when you look at me?" "I see the woman who saved me from a life of hiding. I see the mother of my children, the partner of my heart, the miracle who taught me that love isn't about finding someone who thinks you're perfect. It's about finding someone who thinks your imperfections are perfect for them." Their kiss drew approving smiles from passers-by, who had grown accustomed to the public displays of affection between the territory's most famous couple. But Kestrel and Cordelia barely noticed the audience. They were too busy living the happy ending they'd written together, one day at a time. As the sun set over Willowbrook, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the scarred cowboy who had once believed himself unlovable walked home with his family, secure in the knowledge that sometimes the deepest wounds can heal into the most beautiful love stories. Their tale had begun with a woman who saw past scars to souls, brave enough to let her love him anyway. And if that wasn't the most satisfying ending of all, Kestrel couldn't imagine what could be in the end. Nobody had wanted to marry the scarred rich cowboy until she came along and showed the world
what it truly meant to love someone not despite
their wounds, but because of the strength those wounds had forged. And they lived, as all the best love stories do, happily and completely ever after.